The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the bailiff called the session to order. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators leaning forward, eager to witness the humiliation of the defendant, a black woman who sat calmly at the defense table. Her name was Naomi Cole. Dark brown skin, high cheekbones, and sharp dark eyes framed by thick braids cascading down her back. Her fitted navy blue suit was pristine, her white blouse pressed to perfection. Her hands were folded on the table, and her gaze was steady as she watched the room with quiet intensity. Across the aisle sat Officer Greg Larson. His mouth curled into a smug smile as he lounged back in his chair at the prosecution's table. His pressed uniform gleamed under the overhead lights, the gold badge on his chest catching the light. Larson was tall, broad-shouldered, with short-cropped blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. "You ready for this, sweetheart?" Larson murmured, loud enough for Naomi to hear. "You might as well plead guilty now and save us all the time." Naomi's expression didn't change. Her gaze remained cold and calm as she said, "We'll see." Larson chuckled, shaking his head. "That's cute." Judge Richard Holloway entered the courtroom, adjusting his black robe as he settled into the high-backed chair. He was a man in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and deep lines etched into his face. His sharp blue eyes swept the courtroom before settling on Naomi. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Judge Holloway's gaze sharpened. "Miss Cole, you are charged with obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, and aggravated assault against a law enforcement officer. How do you plead?" David Langston, Naomi's defense attorney, stood beside her. He was in his early 50s, tall, with graying hair and sharp brown eyes. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Judge Holloway's thin mouth curled. "Interesting." Larson chuckled, loud enough for the room to hear. Naomi's gaze flicked toward him. David leaned toward Naomi. "They think this is already over." "Let them think that," Naomi replied softly. The prosecution's table was led by Assistant District Attorney Colin Bennett. Young, clean-cut, and radiating confidence, Bennett stood and buttoned his suit jacket as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bennett began, his voice measured, "this is a straightforward case. Officer Greg Larson was conducting a lawful investigation into narcotics trafficking. Ms. Cole interfered with that investigation, not only obstructing Officer Larson's work, but physically assaulting him when he attempted to place her under arrest." Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. "The evidence," Bennett continued, "will clearly show that Ms. Cole acted with aggression and disregard for the law. Officer Larson was simply doing his job, and for that he was attacked." Larson's smile widened. "Thank you," Bennett said, stepping back. "No further statements." David rose slowly. His movements were calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen," David said, his tone smooth, "the truth is rarely as simple as the prosecution wants you to believe. My client, Miss Naomi Cole, was not interfering with an investigation. She was protecting herself from excessive force and misconduct." Bennett rolled his eyes. Larson shook his head, a quiet laugh escaping his lips. David's gaze sharpened. "And when you hear the facts, when you see the evidence, you'll understand that Officer Larson wasn't acting in the interest of justice. He was acting in the interest of control." A low murmur passed through the gallery. Judge Holloway's gaze hardened. "Mr. Bennett, call your first witness." Bennett smiled. "The prosecution calls Officer Greg Larson to the stand." Larson stood confidently, adjusting his uniform as he stepped toward the stand. He raised his right hand, took the oath, and settled into the witness chair. Bennett approached. "Officer Larson, can you describe the events of the night in question?" Larson smiled faintly. "Yes. I was conducting surveillance on the 500 block of Lexington Avenue. We'd received a tip about narcotics activity in the area. And that's when you encountered Miss Cole." "Yes," Larson said. "She was standing near the scene, looking suspicious. When I approached her and asked for identification, she became hostile." "And how exactly was she hostile?" Larson's smile widened. "She refused to identify herself, raise her voice. Then when I tried to detain her, she shoved me." David's eyes narrowed. Bennett smiled. "So, you were simply trying to do your job?" "That's right," Larson replied smugly. "And she resisted?" "Yes." No further questions, Your Honor. David stood. His expression remained calm as he approached the stand. Officer Larson, David began, you stated that you approached Miss Cole because she was acting suspiciously? Yes. David's eyebrow lifted. And what exactly was suspicious about her behavior? She was standing near a known drug house. Larson replied smoothly. David smiled faintly. Standing near a building is suspicious? Larson's smile faltered. It was the middle of the night. David's smile sharpened. It was 8:45 p.m. Larson's jaw tightened. David stepped closer. And you claim that Miss Cole shoved you? Yes. David's gaze darkened. Do you have any evidence of that? Larson's mouth curled. My body cam was malfunctioning. David's eyes narrowed. Of course it was. No further questions, Your Honor, David said calmly as he returned to his seat. Judge Holloway's gaze sharpened. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. As the courtroom emptied, Larson approached Naomi. His smile was thin and cold. You can drag this out all you want, Larson said softly. But we both know how this ends. Naomi's dark eyes gleamed coldly. Do we? Larson's smile widened. Enjoy your last night of freedom. Naomi's smile sharpened. You should worry about yours. David leaned toward her as Larson walked away. They think you're bluffing. Naomi's eyes flashed. Good. The courtroom was more crowded than the day before. Word had spread. Reporters lined the back wall, notepads and cameras at the ready. The gallery was filled with spectators, some curious, some hostile, some quietly supportive. Naomi Cole walked into the courtroom with the same measured grace as before. Her heels clicked softly against the polished marble floor. Her dark braids were neatly tied back, and her tailored navy blue blazer fit perfectly over her crisp white blouse. She radiated calm and control, despite the storm building around her. Across the room, Officer Greg Larson lounged at the prosecution's table with a smug smile curling at the corners of his mouth. His uniform was pristine, the gold badge on his chest catching the light. He leaned toward ADA Colin Bennett and whispered something that made Bennett chuckle. Naomi sat down at the defense table. David Langston leaned toward her. He's too comfortable. Let him be, Naomi replied, her gaze cold. It makes the fall harder. Judge Richard Holloway entered the courtroom. His sharp blue eyes swept the room before settling on Naomi. His thin mouth curled into a faint smile. This court is now in session, the bailiff announced. Judge Holloway adjusted his glasses. Mr. Bennett, you may proceed. Bennett stood confidently. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call its next witness, Officer Heather Mallory. David's jaw tightened. Of course, he muttered under his breath. Naomi's expression remained calm as Officer Heather Mallory walked to the witness stand. Mallory was tall, blonde, and composed, with a polished uniform and the hardened posture of a seasoned cop. The bailiff swore her in. Bennett approached. Officer Mallory, were you present during the incident involving Miss Cole? Yes, Mallory replied smoothly. And what did you observe? Mallory's gaze sharpened as she glanced toward Naomi. I saw Miss Cole behaving aggressively toward Officer Larson. When he attempted to detain her, she shoved him. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. And you're certain of that? Bennett pressed. Yes, Mallory replied without hesitation. Did Officer Larson act in accordance with department policy? Absolutely, Mallory said confidently. Bennett smiled faintly. No further questions. David stood. His movements were slow and deliberate as he approached the stand. His expression remained calm, but his dark eyes sharpened as he met Mallory's gaze. Officer Mallory, David began smoothly. You stated that you saw Miss Cole shove Officer Larson? Yes. David's brow lifted. And you were standing where? Near the patrol car, Mallory replied. David's eyes narrowed. About how far from the point of contact? Mallory hesitated for a moment. About 15 feet. David smiled faintly. 15 feet. Mallory's jaw tightened. David stepped closer. And your body camera was functioning? Mallory's mouth twisted slightly. No. David's smile sharpened. Why not? Mallory's gaze hardened. Technical malfunction. David tilted his head. Interesting. Because Officer Larson testified that his body cam was also malfunctioning. Mallory's lips pressed together. David's gaze darkened. So we're supposed to believe that two body cameras, issued by the same department, malfunctioned at the exact same time? Mallory's mouth tightened. It happens. David's smile widened. Does it? Mallory's gaze sharpened. Yes. David's smile faded. His voice lowered. Or maybe it wasn't a malfunction. Mallory's eyes darkened. I don't know what you're suggesting. David leaned forward slightly. Of course you do. Mallory's jaw clenched. David stepped back, hands clasped behind his back. No further questions. Mallory left the stand stiffly. Larson's smile remained, but it was thinner now. His blue eyes flicked toward Naomi. Bennett stood. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call its next witness, Officer Greg Larson. David's jaw tightened. Here we go. Larson rose confidently. He adjusted his uniform as he stepped toward the stand, his badge gleaming under the lights. The bailiff swore him in. Larson settled into the chair, his smile widening as he met Naomi's gaze. Bennett approached. Officer Larson, you testified yesterday that Miss Cole shoved you during an attempt to detain her. That's right, Larson said. And you maintain that her behavior was aggressive and unprovoked? Absolutely. And your body cam malfunction? Yes. Bennett smiled faintly. And did Miss Cole say anything to you before the incident? Larson's smile widened. She told me to get out of her way. A low murmur passed through the gallery. Bennett stepped back. No further questions. David stood. His gaze was cold as he approached the stand. Officer Larson, David began, you testified that you were conducting a lawful investigation into narcotics activity when you encountered Miss Cole. Yes. And you approached her because you believed she was involved? Correct. David's brow lifted. Did you find any narcotics on her? Larson hesitated. No. David smiled faintly. Did you find any narcotics in the vicinity? Larson's jaw tightened. No. David's gaze sharpened. So why did you detain her? Larson's mouth twisted. Because she refused to identify herself. David's eyes narrowed. That's not illegal. Larson's smile faded. David stepped closer. And you claim that Miss Cole shoved you? Yes. David's smile sharpened. And yet you have no physical evidence to support that claim? My word is evidence, Larson replied coolly. David's gaze darkened. Not in this courtroom. A ripple of tension passed through the room. David stepped back. No further questions. Larson left the stand, his smile tight and thin. Naomi's gaze remained cold as his eyes met hers. Judge Holloway's voice broke the tension. Court will reconvene tomorrow morning. As Larson walked past Naomi, he leaned close. That was cute, but it's not going to help you. Naomi's dark eyes sharpened. Don't be so sure. Larson's smile widened. We'll see. The next morning, the atmosphere in the courtroom was different. Tense. Charged. The easy confidence that Officer Greg Larson and ADA Colin Bennett had displayed the day before was starting to fray at the edges. Naomi Cole walked into the courtroom with the same measured calm as before. Her heels clicked against the polished marble floor, her sharp gaze scanning the room. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something big was about to happen. David Langston leaned toward Naomi as they sat down at the defense table. They know something's coming. Good, Naomi replied softly. Let them sweat. Judge Richard Holloway entered the courtroom, adjusting his glasses as he took his seat. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced. Bennett stood confidently. Your Honor, the prosecution rests. David stood. The defense would like to call Miss Cole to the stand. A low murmur passed through the courtroom. Larson's smile thinned. Bennett's gaze sharpened. Naomi stood gracefully and walked toward the witness stand. She placed her hand on the Bible, took the oath, and settled into the chair. Her expression was calm and unbothered, but her eyes were sharp as glass. David approached the stand, his expression measured. Miss Cole, could you please state your full name for the court? Naomi Alexandria Cole. And your occupation? Naomi smiled faintly. Consultant. David's brow lifted. Consultant in what field? Naomi's eyes gleamed. Law enforcement. A ripple of confusion passed through the gallery. Larson's smile faltered. David stepped closer. Miss Cole, could you clarify your connection to law enforcement? Naomi leaned toward the microphone. Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. I work closely with federal agencies on internal investigations. Bennett's brow furrowed. Larson's jaw tightened. David smiled faintly. And were you working in that capacity on the night of the alleged incident? Naomi's dark eyes flashed. Yes. Gasps spread through the courtroom. Larson's mouth twitched. His eyes narrowed toward Naomi. David's smile widened. And why were you in the vicinity of Officer Larson's investigation? Naomi's gaze sharpened. Because I was conducting an internal investigation into Officer Larson and his connection to a network of corrupt officers. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Judge Holloway's gavel slammed down. Order. Bennett shot to his feet. Objection. Overruled. Judge Holloway's voice was sharp. Bennett's face darkened. Your Honor. David's gaze sharpened. Shall I continue? Judge Holloway's mouth curled. Proceed. David stepped closer to Naomi. Miss Cole, could you clarify the purpose of this investigation? Naomi's eyes darkened. We had reason to believe that Officer Larson was working with a known drug syndicate, providing protection and information in exchange for financial compensation. Larson's face paled. David's gaze sharpened. And what evidence do you have to support this? Naomi reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and withdrew a small silver flash drive. David took the drive and walked toward the court's media console. He inserted it into the port, and the screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. Grainy black and white footage appeared on the screen. The timestamp in the corner read June 12th, 10:17 p.m., 2 hours after Naomi's alleged arrest. The video showed a dark alley behind the Lexington warehouse. Officer Larson stood with his back to the camera. Another man approached, dressed in dark clothes, his face partially obscured by the shadows. Unknown man, we've got a problem. Larson, smirking, what kind of problem? Unknown man, she's FBI. Gasps erupted through the courtroom. Larson's face twisted. He sat rigid at the prosecution's table. His knuckles whitened as his hands clenched into fists. Larson, on video, she doesn't know yet. Unknown man. And if she does? Larson, coldly. Then we make sure she doesn't say anything. The video cut out. Judge Holloway's gaze sharpened. Miss Cole. David's voice was sharp. Miss Cole, do you recognize the voice of the other man in the video? Naomi's gaze narrowed. Yes. Who? Naomi's dark eyes turned toward Larson. Officer Greg Larson's partner, Officer Brett Keller. More gasps swept through the courtroom. Larson's face twisted into a mask of rage. His mouth opened as though he was going to protest, but nothing came out. David's gaze sharpened. And do you have evidence linking Officer Larson to financial transactions with this syndicate? Naomi's lips curled. Yes. David pulled a stack of printed bank statements from his briefcase. Officer Larson received multiple deposits, large deposits, from offshore accounts linked to known drug traffickers. Judge Holloway's mouth curled into a hard line. Officer Larson. Larson's face was red with fury. This is bullshit. Judge Holloway's gavel slammed down. Enough. David's gaze hardened. Miss Cole, were you detained unlawfully that night? Yes. And did Officer Larson use excessive force? Yes. David's gaze sharpened. And why would Officer Larson try to silence you? Naomi's gaze didn't waver. Because he knew I had enough evidence to bring him down. Larson shot to his feet. This is a setup. Judge Holloway's gaze sharpened. Officer Larson, sit down. Larson's face twisted with rage. He pointed at Naomi. You think you're untouchable? Naomi's dark eyes gleamed. I don't think I know. Judge Holloway's eyes darkened. Officer Larson, you are hereby remanded into custody, pending a full internal investigation. 2 bailiffs approached Larson. You can't do this. Larson snarled as they seized his arms. This isn't over. Naomi's smile widened faintly. Yes, it is. The bailiffs dragged Larson toward the side exit. His eyes burned with rage as they locked onto Naomi's. David leaned toward Naomi. That was impressive. Naomi's smile sharpened. I'm not done yet. The sound of the heavy iron doors closing behind Greg Larson echoed through the courtroom. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every eye was now focused on Naomi Cole, the black woman who had just exposed one of Lexington's most decorated officers as a corrupt, dangerous criminal. Naomi sat calmly at the defense table, her hands folded neatly on the polished wood surface. The gold FBI badge pinned to her blazer now glinted under the fluorescent lights, no longer a hidden truth, but a public symbol of her authority. David Langston leaned toward her, his smile razor-sharp. Well, that escalated quickly. Naomi's dark eyes gleamed. We're just getting started. Across the aisle, ADA Colin Bennett sat stiffly at the prosecution's table. His face was pale, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle in his cheek twitched. His eyes flicked toward Judge Richard Holloway, who was adjusting his glasses and looking down at Naomi with a sharp, calculating gaze. "Miss Cole," Judge Holloway said, his voice cold, "you have presented serious allegations against Officer Larson and his connection to criminal activity. Do you have any further evidence to support these claims?" Naomi's smile widened faintly. "Actually, Your Honor, I do." Gasps swept through the gallery. Larson was already in custody, and now Naomi was about to reveal more. David stood. "Your Honor, the defense would like to present additional evidence obtained through an internal federal investigation into Officer Larson and his associates." Bennett shot to his feet. "Objection. On what grounds?" Judge Holloway asked. Bennett's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Judge Holloway's gaze sharpened. "Overruled. Proceed." David walked toward the media console and inserted a second flash drive. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life once more. "Exhibit D," David announced. The video showed a dimly lit parking garage. The timestamp read June 10th, 11:43 p.m., 2 days before Naomi's arrest. Officer Larson stood with his back to the camera. Another figure approached, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit. His face was partially obscured by shadows. David pressed a button on the remote. The audio crackled to life. "Larson," low voice, "you're sure this is secure?" Unknown man, deep voice, "I'm sure." "Larson, she's getting too close. If she figures it out, it's not just me, it's everyone." Unknown man, coldly, "Then maybe you should handle it." Larson's mouth curled into a smile. "I have a plan for that." The video froze. Gasps filled the room. David turned toward Naomi. "Miss Cole, do you recognize the other individual in the video?" Naomi's dark eyes gleamed. "Yes." "And who is it?" Naomi's gaze sharpened. "Captain Brett Keller, Officer Larson's direct supervisor." A wave of shock rolled through the room. Judge Holloway's brow furrowed. "Captain Keller?" Naomi nodded. "The same Captain Keller who oversaw Officer Larson's internal reviews, all of which were conveniently cleared of wrongdoing." David's smile darkened. "And, Your Honor, we've obtained financial records showing that Keller and Larson shared multiple offshore accounts linked to wire transfers from shell companies tied to the Martinez cartel." Judge Holloway's eyes darkened. "And you have evidence to support this?" David smiled faintly. "Yes." David pulled out a stack of printed bank statements and handed them to the bailiff. "These are certified financial records showing deposits totaling over $2 million over the last 3 years. Bennett shot to his feet. "Objection. This is overruled." Judge Holloway snapped. Bennett's face flushed. His hands curled into fists. Naomi's eyes gleamed coldly. "Captain Keller authorized cover-ups of Officer Larson's misconduct. He ensured that all complaints against Larson were dismissed internally." David's gaze sharpened. "And why would Captain Keller do that?" Naomi's smile was thin and dangerous. "Because they were protecting the Martinez cartel's drug pipeline and making a fortune in the process." Judge Holloway's mouth curled downward. "Captain Keller is a decorated officer with over 20 years of service. Are you accusing him of collusion with organized crime?" Naomi's gaze sharpened. "I'm not accusing him of anything. I'm proving it." David held up another flash drive. "Your Honor, the defense would like to present one more piece of evidence." Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. "Proceed." David inserted the drive. The screen flickered again. This time, the footage was clearer. It showed a luxury hotel lobby. Captain Keller stood near the front desk, speaking with a tall man in a black suit. "Keller, on video that's handled. Man in black suit. And the girl?" Keller, smiling, Larson will take care of it. The video cut out. Judge Holloway's expression darkened. David turned toward Naomi. Agent Cole, was Captain Keller aware of your identity? Yes. And why would he have Larson target you? Naomi's gaze sharpened. Because I was assigned to investigate the department's connection to organized crime. And they were scared. Bennett's mouth twisted. This is outrageous. Sit down, Mr. Bennett. Judge Holloway's voice thundered through the courtroom. Bennett sat. His face was white. Judge Holloway's gaze turned toward the gallery. Captain Brett Keller, please stand. A ripple of movement passed through the crowd. Captain Keller, seated in the gallery, his mouth tight, slowly rose to his feet. Judge Holloway's gaze hardened. You are hereby remanded into custody for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and aiding and abetting organized crime. Two bailiffs moved toward Keller. His mouth twisted. This is a mistake. Judge Holloway's gaze didn't waver. Take him. As Keller was led away, Naomi stood slowly. Her gaze followed him, cold and unflinching. Keller's eyes locked with hers for a brief moment. You think this ends with me? Keller hissed. Naomi's smile widened faintly. No, but it starts with you. David leaned toward Naomi. Well played. Naomi's gaze darkened. We're not finished. David's brow lifted. What's next? Naomi's smile was thin. We follow the money. Captain Brett Keller was escorted out of the courtroom by two federal agents, his face twisted in rage and humiliation. The heavy iron door slammed shut behind him with a resounding clank that echoed through the silent room. Naomi Cole sat motionless at the defense table, her dark eyes steady as steel. The calm on her face was in sharp contrast to the chaos that had unfolded over the last 2 hours. Larson and Keller were both in custody. The truth had been exposed, and now it was time for consequences. David Langston leaned toward her. Well, that was satisfying. Naomi's lips curled into a faint smile. Not yet. Across the aisle, ADA Colin Bennett sat at the prosecution's table. His face was pale, beads of sweat forming at his hairline. His hands were clasped tightly together on the table, his knuckles white. Judge Richard Holloway adjusted his glasses and leaned forward slightly. His gaze swept the room, his expression cold and hard. This court has heard enough, he said. Bennett's mouth twisted. He rose from his seat, his voice thin and strained. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to request a recess. No. Judge Holloway's tone was sharp as glass. The facts are clear. The evidence is irrefutable. I see no reason to delay a ruling. Bennett's mouth tightened. He sat down slowly, his eyes dark with defeat. Judge Holloway's gaze shifted toward Naomi. Agent Cole, please rise. Naomi stood, her posture straight and composed. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room like a heavy fog. The gallery was deathly silent. Judge Holloway's thin mouth curled downward. In light of the overwhelming evidence presented by the defense, this court hereby dismisses all charges against Miss Cole with prejudice. Gasps swept through the room. Naomi's expression remained calm. Judge Holloway's gavel struck the bench. Furthermore, he continued, this court is formally recommending a federal review of the Lexington Police Department's internal affairs procedures, including all cases involving Officer Larson and Captain Keller. Bennett's face blanched, and Judge Holloway added, his gaze cold, Captain Keller and Officer Larson will remain in federal custody pending criminal trials on charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and aiding and abetting organized crime. David's smile widened. I like this judge. Naomi's dark eyes gleamed. Judge Holloway's gaze hardened. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a heavy thud. Reporters surged toward Naomi the moment the court doors opened. Camera flashes exploded in the room as microphones were shoved toward her face. Agent Cole. Naomi, how long have you known about the corruption? Did you expect Officer Larson to be involved? David stepped toward her. You don't have to answer. Naomi held up her hand. The room quieted. Her dark eyes scanned the crowd. I knew there was corruption in this department for months, Naomi said calmly. But it wasn't just about Larson and Keller. It was about a system that allowed them to operate unchecked for years. That ends today. Agent Cole, do you think more officers are involved? Naomi's gaze sharpened. We'll find out. David leaned toward her. Bold move. Naomi's smile was faint. It's not bold if it's true. A black SUV with government plates pulled up to the curb outside the courthouse. 2 federal agents stood near the door, waiting. Marcus Keene, Naomi's colleague from the FBI, approached from the sidewalk. He was dressed in a dark suit, his badge clipped to his belt. Agent Cole, Keene said, Larson and Keller are being processed now. The DOJ is preparing federal charges. Naomi's gaze sharpened. Good. Keene's mouth curled into a thin smile. You really shook the tree. Naomi's smile widened faintly. Let's see what falls out. David chuckled. So what happens next? Naomi's gaze darkened. Now we clean up the mess. Keene's eyes narrowed. We've already traced several accounts connected to Keller's offshore deposits. Looks like there's more money and more people involved. How deep? Naomi asked. Keene handed her a thin file. We've already flagged over 15 suspicious transactions involving officers at the precinct. David's brow lifted. 15. And that's just the start, Keene said. Naomi's dark eyes flashed. Follow the money. Keene's smile widened. That's the plan. David stepped closer to Naomi. You just took down 2 of the most powerful men in this department. You could walk away right now, and no one would blame you. Naomi's gaze sharpened. Walking away isn't an option. David smiled faintly. Of course not. Marcus Keene's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. Looks like Larson is already asking for a deal. Naomi's brow lifted. What's he offering? Names, Keene said. He's ready to give up the network. David's smile widened. Well. Naomi's gaze sharpened. No deals. Keene's brow furrowed. Are you sure? Naomi's eyes darkened. He doesn't get to walk away from this. Keene's mouth twisted into a smile. Understood. David's gaze softened. So what happens now? Naomi's smile was cold and sharp. We keep going. Keene nodded. And if someone higher up tries to stop you? Naomi's dark eyes flashed. Then we take them down too. David's smile widened. You're dangerous. Naomi's lips curled. Good. She turned toward the SUV. David and Keene followed close behind as the driver opened the back door. Naomi slid into the seat, her gaze steady as the city skyline stretched out in the distance. The driver glanced toward her in the rearview mirror. Where to, Agent Cole? Naomi's dark eyes gleamed. Headquarters. David chuckled. Just another day at the office? Naomi's smile was faint. Something like that. The SUV pulled away from the courthouse and disappeared into the city traffic. 3 weeks later, the front page of the Washington Post read, Corruption scandal exposed in Lexington Police Department. Top officers and prosecutor face federal charges. Beneath the headline was a photo of Larson and Keller being escorted out of the courthouse in handcuffs. David sat across from Naomi in a quiet corner of a Washington coffee shop. So what happens now? Naomi's dark eyes gleamed. We go higher. David's brow lifted. And if they push back? Naomi's smile sharpened. Then we push harder. 3 months later, the Lexington Police Department was a different place. The headquarters building, a cold, gray monolith in the center of the city, was now under the quiet but undeniable control of a federal task force. Naomi Cole stood at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out over the city. Her dark braids were pulled back, and her tailored navy blue blazer fit perfectly over a crisp white blouse. The gold FBI badge pinned to her lapel glinted faintly in the morning sunlight. Marcus Keene stood beside her, his hands in the pockets of his dark suit. His sharp brown eyes followed Naomi's gaze toward the street below, where news vans and clusters of reporters were already gathering. You made a lot of enemies, Keene said. Naomi's dark eyes gleamed. Good. David Langston appeared behind them, coffee cup in hand. They're calling you a hero, David said with a smirk. Front page of every major paper. Naomi's smile was faint. They don't know the whole story. David's brow lifted. Then tell them. Naomi's gaze sharpened. David tilted his head toward the crowd of reporters gathering at the bottom of the courthouse steps. They're waiting. Naomi took a breath and descended the steps with measured grace. The moment she stepped onto the sidewalk, microphones and cameras surged toward her. Agent Cole. Naomi, do you believe this will lead to more arrests? How many officers were involved? Naomi raised her hand. The crowd quieted instantly. Her dark eyes swept over the faces in the crowd. 3 months ago, Officer Greg Larson and Captain Brett Keller were exposed as participants in a criminal enterprise, protecting and profiting from the Martinez cartel's operations in Lexington. But it wasn't just them. This wasn't the work of a few bad actors. It was systemic. Camera shutters clicked rapidly. Naomi's voice sharpened. It happened because a system was built to allow it. And when people tried to speak up, they were silenced. That stops now. Agent Cole, do you believe other officers are still involved? Naomi's gaze darkened. We've already identified at least 8 additional officers connected to Keller's operation. They're being processed as we speak. David's smile widened. Hell of a cleanup job. A reporter pushed forward. Agent Cole, how long have you known about this network? Naomi's dark eyes flashed. Long enough. Another reporter shouted. Do you think this will restore faith in the department? Naomi's jaw tightened. Faith is earned, and it starts with accountability. Marcus Keene stepped beside her. Agent Cole has done her job. Now it's up to the department to do theirs. A young woman, standing at the edge of the crowd, caught Naomi's attention. She was in her early 20s, dark skin, wearing a modest blue blouse and jeans. Her eyes were wide as she watched Naomi. Naomi stepped away from the microphones and approached her. You okay? The woman nodded slowly. You used it up to them. You made them listen. Naomi's expression softened. It wasn't just me. But you didn't give up. The woman's gaze sharpened. Most people wouldn't have done that. Naomi's smile was faint. Maybe it's time that changed. The woman smiled. Thank you. Naomi's eyes softened. Don't thank me yet. David leaned toward her, feeling sentimental. Naomi's gaze darkened. Focused. Keene stepped toward them. We have a problem. Naomi's eyes narrowed. What kind of problem? Keene handed her a thin file. Larson's deal. David frowned. He's cutting a deal? Keene nodded. He's flipping on the cartel. Naomi's brow lifted. And Keene's gaze sharpened. He's claiming that the protection extended beyond the department. Naomi's expression hardened. How far? Keene's mouth tightened. Judges. Prosecutors. Even a sitting state senator. David let out a low whistle. That's ambitious. Naomi's dark eyes flashed. Who's the senator? Keene's gaze darkened. Robert Whitmore. David's smile faded. Whitmore. Naomi's gaze sharpened. The same Robert Whitmore who chairs the state's Justice Committee? Keene nodded. And the same Robert Whitmore who oversaw the funding for the Lexington Police Department's expansion budget. Naomi's jaw tightened. Larson's evidence. Keene handed her another file. Deposits into offshore accounts connected to Whitmore's office. Larson's testimony places him at multiple meetings with cartel leadership. David's brow furrowed. And Larson's willing to testify? Keene's mouth curled. He's asking for immunity. Naomi's smile sharpened coldly. No. Keene frowned. Naomi. No deals, Naomi said flatly. He doesn't get to walk away from this. Keene's eyes narrowed. Then how do you plan to use him? Naomi's gaze darkened. We squeeze him for everything he's worth. Then we bury him. David chuckled. I'm starting to feel bad for the guy. Naomi's smile widened faintly. Don't. Keene's phone buzzed. He checked the screen and frowned. FBI's moving on Whitmore now. Federal agents are already at his residence. David's eyes widened. That was fast. Keene smiled faintly. This time, we're not giving them room to run. Naomi's eyes gleamed. Good. David leaned toward Naomi. You know this is only going to get bigger, right? Naomi's smile was cold and sharp. That's the point. David studied her for a moment. And what happens if someone higher up tries to stop you? Naomi's dark eyes flashed. They can try. David's smile widened. And if they push back? Naomi's gaze darkened. Then we push harder. Marcus Keene's phone buzzed again. He checked the screen. Whitmore's lawyer is requesting a statement from the DOJ. David raised an eyebrow. What's the response? Naomi's smile sharpened. No comment. David's laugh was low and dark. I like this side of you. Naomi's gaze glinted. Good. Keene nodded toward the black SUV parked at the curb. You coming? Naomi's gaze lifted toward the city skyline. We're not finished yet. David's brow lifted. So where to next? Naomi's dark eyes gleamed coldly. We follow the money. David's smile widened. You always know how to make things interesting. Naomi's eyes flashed. That's the idea. She slid into the SUV. David and Keen followed close behind. The driver pulled away from the curb, merging into traffic as the city hummed around them. Naomi's gaze sharpened as the skyline disappeared behind them. Game on.